Good the day after Thanksgiving, Professor Tootle. How are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Good, good. You're the subject matter expert or historian on friendship, right? Is that on your bona fides? Is that on your curriculum vitae?
No,
Okay.
absolutely not.
Well,
I have no special expertise in this whatsoever.
why do you think I want to ask about it then? Why am I just doing a wasted show after Thanksgiving, or do I think you can add something to it?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a bald-headed guy with glasses over there, Derek Katzum, who who's on today's show. You know, I have a lot of old friends. I make friends slowly, but I tend to keep them forever. So maybe I'm good at that.
Yeah, so but that's more in realms you don't. I mean, it's not that you don't respect them, but you don't give a lot of credence to the sociology and the psychology degrees.
No.
I know you like liberal arts degrees, but it's not like you
No,
think
hold on.
those.
I love liberal arts degrees. You'll
Right.
never hear me denigrate the liberal arts
Yeah,
degree.
you love the liberal
Yes,
arts degrees, but you're
absolutely.
not a big fan of sociologists per se. You don't hate them or
No,
anything.
well, there are some good ones out there. I always say it's such an interesting subject. I wish that better people did it because every
Ah,
now and then there will be one who just comes along and knocks your socks off and says like, "Oh, this is what sociology could be." Somebody who
gotcha.
really like. But there are very few people who can do the hard work of understanding the data, which is part of it, and then turning it into a story that actually makes sense and that is matches reality rather than because what and I know not to pick on sociologists, but almost all social scientists do, and it's my favorite joke, and it's a history joke, so it's not funny. But what did the political scientists say to the historian? Well, I know it happened, but does it work in theory? Um,
Yeah.
and I don't like it when these people uh, lean too much on uh, theory instead of what happened. Hey, and there's my other good friend Stephen Knott just logged in. How about that? I got two of my friends, and well, Bart, is I consider a friend
Well,
as
I
well.
told you you'd be a little surprised, and I
I am
invited.
a little surprised. This is
Yeah.
I'm very surprised.
Well, good. That's my thing.
I always say that Stephen Knott is my brother from another mother. Uh, he is somebody who he's the better version of me in every sense of the word.
Wow, what
Um,
a nice thing. Well,
you take
they're my
everything
thanks.
that I am, and then you make it the good version, and you have Stephen Knott.
Well, they're my Thanksgiving gift to you, Professor. I figure it might be nice to give thanks. And I like Thanksgiving because you don't give gifts, and this isn't Thanksgiving anymore; it's the day after. So I figured inviting a couple of your history professors to correct your record might be kind of fun.
Well,
So,
even Knott also belongs in this special category of that I really put a couple of people in. My advisor, Alonzo Hamby. One of the things that Derek and I used to say about him is when we disagree with him, we're wrong. We just haven't figured out how yet. Like
how
someday we'll figure out how he was right and we're wrong. We just don't know how. Because Alonzo Hamby was such a careful historian that he was always right. We just, you know, sometimes it took us a little while to figure out how. So, and
well,
I
one of the
think of Steve Knott as being in that category too. Maybe
well,
not
what
quite an Alonzo Hamby, but man, he's just a shade underneath Lon for me.
I love that, and he's also been kind enough to author a book for us, not us, but humanity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and because that's admirable, and I hope you do some one day as well, Professor. Okay, we're going to start the show in this way. I know we're already talking, but here's the intent of the show, Professor Tootle.
Gotcha.
Um, I have a couple agenda items for you. And with this over our 100th show, over 3 or 4 years, we've been doing this for newcomers, every imaginable topic: abortion, gays, war, guns, every imaginable topic, the history of the Republican Party, the history of the Democratic Party. I mean, we've just gone through every contemporary public policy issue with a historic bent. And I really want to do on friendship because I think this should be a book that you write, Professor, from a history angle. And it's really the history of relationships, but not just warring relationships, but the history of friendships and how you build coalitions between political families. So we're going to have you talk for just a minute. Then I'm going to go to Professor Katzum, to kind of retort or add something in that you're missing, because they might be able to add a nice forward to your book, or you could acknowledge them for their contribution for us starting this book of yours today. You have often, and you don't have to take this line of thought, but you have often, during a theme that you've talked about our shows, talked about how humanity associates themselves. And it's usually by family security relationships, and then extended families, then tribes, then, and you talk about nations and uh, how we're wrong in the way we view race, because that's racism, not the way it really was. Everybody hated each other. Everybody was stealing each other's stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Can you just give some kind of overview that might apply to the history of friendships? Then we're going to see what Derek and Stephen want to critique or add to your overview.
Sure. Well, it's funny because if I was to talk about friendship, one of the most important ways I would start is with Stephen Knott's book on Hamilton and Washington, because, and so I'll just set that aside and leave that for
Okay.
him.
Oh, leave it to
Since
the
we
expert who
literally
wrote
have
the
the
book
guy
who's
who
going
wrote
to.
the book,
Yeah.
along with my other friend, Tony Williams. He co-authored that book with another one of my friends, Tony Williams. And So I think that it's important, and one of the things that I look for in leadership when I'm assessing presidencies, or even trying to decide who to vote for, is I often ask myself, does this person have any friends? Because it's always a little bit weird when you have presidents who have no friends.
Well, but
And
as we've talked about before, the average American has 1.9 friends. So why is that weird? Why would we expect different from a president?
Well, you would just expect that over the course of a lifetime, you would have accumulated people who you're willing to be vulnerable to and who trust you in a somewhat equal relationship. I mean, uh, to a certain extent, you know, Professor Katzman and I are such deep personal friends because our friendship goes back to when we were both doing embarrassing things, that we're vulnerable to each other in a way that, Stephen Knott and I, we might share a joke or something uh, privately, and we will keep each other's confidence. But like, I don't have the goods on Stephen Knott the way I do with Derek. So so I think that it's a sort of a tell when people don't have any long-term relationships or friends. I think about somebody like, just to move a little beyond Washington and Hamilton, people found Thomas Jefferson very personally charming, and he was good friends with John Adams. And John Adams is a perfect example of a guy who I sort of always identify with, because he had such a sometimes abrasive personality, and yet he did have loyal friends, and his relationships with his family were so uh, intimate and wonderful. I
Well, how
mean,
about Ben Franklin? Wouldn't he be the classic guy with a ton of lifelong friends?
yeah, I'll just sort of punt on this and say that
For fun, I
if you were
guess.
to ask me to name 10 of them, I don't think I could. But yes, so I'm not a Ben Franklin expert, but the way in which we express ourselves to our friends is also so um, open and intimate, and and I think about this. Actually, here's a good story about friendship that might get the conversation kicked off. Back in Athens, Ohio, in the late 90s, we had a Soviet historian come. And I mean, by Soviet historian, somebody from the Soviet Union who was a historian came to, and this was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to give us a talk about what it was like and sort of an update on the status of the archives and things like that. And I asked him a question where I said, what, uh, what was good about the Soviet Union? What will you miss about the Soviet Union? And he sort of stared off into space for a long time. Uh, and he said two things. He said, first of all, there are some people who are just so old that they're vulnerable now that our society is collapsing, and the sort of safety net is being swept away, and don't know how this is going to end up. But he said the second thing, and this has stuck with me obviously for whatever it is, 26 years or so. He said, I'm never going to have friends like I did in the Soviet Union because in every friendship I was risking my life because you
Mm,
could make it because every single person who you were friends with, you were trusting them with your life, because anybody could report you for anything. And just for a slight political favor, a little bit better job, a food ration, getting ahead of somebody in line for a present you wanted for your kids or something. And so essentially every single person who you spoke openly with and you called a friend, you were relying on them uh, to never turn you in to the authorities. And he says, I'm never going to have friendships like that again. And he said, but that's a good thing.
yeah.
It indicates that the stakes are much lower. But maybe that will kick off our.
And let me add one more question, Corey, caveat, and then the professors can give a retort on either one of these or whatever they'd like to talk about. You have often said that liberals and conservatives in America, not left and right, we've talked about that a lot in other shows, but normal mainstream people that we know in society generally agree about most things. It's just like 52-48 or even 49-51 because we're not all pro-choice or all pro-life or pro-gun or anti-gun or pro-gay or anti-gay. And we have a lot in common. We're just our systems designed to expose that small sliver of differences. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and then we'll open it up to questions?
I mean, in a way, I almost think that social media made this worse, but because you found out that your friends and neighbors all had wacky opinions that you never knew that they had. You'd say, "Oh my gosh, you think what? How do you think the Fed works?" Or that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that the United States was founded as an ideological nation state,
There we go.
and we were created, and how we're supposed to see the Declaration is the common sense of the subject. And it means that all Americans share all of the same values. And I noticed that Obama is on this pluralism kick. So I don't know if maybe he's
You
recently
see, you're in
discovered
good
American
company
history.
again, Professor.
Yeah, maybe he's been watching Tootle Talk, but the whole idea behind pluralism is that we share all the same values, and we just emphasize different ones at different times based on our own experiences. And what we're agreeing to do is to negotiate peacefully between these values. And anybody who does that, I say that person's an American, that person is a patriot, um, and we can all be friends. I say the real political spectrum in the United States, and the way I draw this up in the classroom is I draw a big circle and I write us, and then outside that circle I write everybody else, because as long as somebody is willing to live under a regime of no violence and adhering to rule of law, well, we can discuss almost anything else.
Lovely.
And a lot of leadership, this is something that I think Harry Truman said, but or it might have been in that Merle Miller book, so maybe it was a made up quote, but that real leadership is you know all the hard decisions are made before they get to you, and you just have to pick which one of these is, it's 49 and 51, and you have to guess which one is the right thing to do, and you'll never know if you were wrong or not. But by the time it gets to the president's desk, it's a binary choice. And we're all just kind of stumbling through life. A lot of politicians, if they're of good character, and this is why I always, agree with people who say character is destiny, but if they're of good character, um, they're all trying to do the right thing. And they're making a guess. And thus they deserve a little bit of grace, as long as they are people of high public character. And anyway, so you can be friends with practically anybody, but we all have to draw this sort of line, and the line with me is people who are outside of that circle, people who want to use violence or um, don't agree to follow rule of law, you know. But I'll include within that, there are people who believe in civil disobedience, and I'm fine with true civil disobedience.
Mhm.
Break the law, suffer the consequences in order to show this that there's a moral problem in society. I'm deeply sympathetic with that tradition. When it's not civil disobedience, when you're, throwing rocks at cops or whatever, like that's where I got to draw the line.
I think
But
it's really helpful. I think this would be a worthwhile book for you to talk about it from a historical perspective. So
uh,
I know you don't want to write a book. I'm here to help you. The first step to recovery is to realize you have a problem, and you're a professor without a book. Professor,
yeah,
before I introduce you to the other two friends of yours, it would be nice to tell you some of my friends who may not know you. I don't think they've ever been on the show before. Just a quick outline of what your specialties are, what your degrees and specialties are, because I'm going to ask Derek the same thing and Professor Knott. What are your degrees and specialties?
should start calling them out by name so they'll know when they're being
Professor Tootle,
called.
what are your degrees and
Oh,
specialties?
I'm a American history professor. I studied political, intellectual history and Soviet history, and I I've forgotten most of it, but intellectual history as well. And I did a cognate field in American literature. Teach at the College of Sequoias in Visalia, my hometown.
Cool. Undergrad, master's, and PhD in history.
All in history. Yep. Yep.
Yep. And you are, because I've acclaimed you to be so, but there's some truth to this. You are the preeminent conservative contemporary political
I'm not preeminent
history
in anything.
professor
You need to
in
stop it.
America, right? I mean,
Oh,
they're
no.
very, oh, come on. Who's
I'll put myself in the top 300. How about that?
there? Well, I hope there's more than 301. So good. Professor Tootle, thank you for all your work in trying to have people understand America. Okay, Derek Katzum, do you mind, Professor, giving just a line or two of your bona fides and then give a retort in whatever way you wish to Professor Tootle?
Yeah, so Williams College, double major in history and poli sci, North Carolina, Charlotte, master's degree in Southern history, and then PhD at Ohio University. My work's on U.S. and South African history, kind of split evenly. When I'm in South Africa, I spend a bunch of my year in South Africa, and then I'm in Texas. Mostly, civil rights, anti-apartheid, but I think I'm a
Laying in
pretty
his bed.
good generalist. I'm in a bed in San Antonio because I'm at family in San Antonio. I would not ordinarily do this from my bed. Uh, it's the only place I can do it where there aren't people running around who just did ridiculous Black Friday stuff.
You're just like
Professor,
Mamie
like,
Eisenhower. She always did her meetings from bed every morning.
well,
You're just like
Professor
Mamie.
Professor Katzum, just as Professor Tootle is a renowned conservative history professor, you're kind of a renowned liberal history professor, right?
Oh, I mean, renowned is putting an awful lot of tensile strength on a board that I can't hold up. I think I'm a good historian. I've done work on sport and politics, on civil rights, on anti-apartheid. I am absolutely a lefty liberal. That's where
You're
my,
friends with
my
Professor Tootle. What's the deal with that? I don't mean to interrupt, but wow. Okay, what is your retort to Professor Tootle or expansion? What would you like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve's always had a lot of value in the rule of law, except for apartheid South Africa was the ultimate example of a country with the rule of law. There was nothing lawless about everything about apartheid. And in fact, what happened in the period from about 1948 till about 1960 in particular is the kind of passage of law through theoretically democratic processes, though obviously not, that would be the embodiment of the rule of law. And in fact, part of the reason why apartheid South Africa got such cover from much of the West was because both of the rule of law, but also because they were good allies in the Cold War, right? And which did demonstrable harm, not only in South Africa but across Africa. So I'm always wary of the rule of law because it's easy to construct laws in authoritarian societies.
Well,
Now,
but Professor, the rule of law had some form of democracy where everyone could vote equally and their vote counted, and then you create policies of a representative authority that then allowed apartheid. No, none of that's true. That doesn't. The rule of
well,
law is.
so you just basically described the United States for a huge swath of its existence too. I mean, be careful about sort of allowing people to vote being the standard for, because boy, let me tell you, let me tell you what Mickey Schwerner died. Let me tell you what Andrew Goodman died for. Let me tell you what James Chaney died for. Let me tell you what Viola Liuzzo died for. Um, and then the beatings. Like I can show, you could see the dent in John Lewis's skull from the beatings that he received on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So, but
Okay, okay, let me interrupt myself then. Professor Tootle, I brought a knife to a gunfight, clearly, and Derek just, like, slapping me around. Um, push back on the rule of
Oh,
law.
I would just say, like, I'm a
I mean,
supporter
it's
of the American Revolution as well. Like, there are justifiable revolutions if you're talking about. I mean, I think that the American Revolution was based on the idea of equality, right, securing individual rights. It's not just rule of law. Again, understanding pluralism says there's no single one of these things that is the end all be all. You can't just say rule of law and and by the way, no rights of the individual, no, no consent to the governed. We're not going to do anything else except for rule of law. That's not enough. It's got to be everything in that It's got to be everything that's here. Like, so much so that it's on my kitchen pantry. You should tell Tony Williams it's literally on my kitchen pantry. Like, so I never forget everything on this list of
what is it?
oh, this is the handy thing that the Bill of Rights Institute gives to teachers to understand the foundations of our government. And I and I want to make sure it's available to point these things out to my kids when I need to.
Well, good,
Uh,
but don't keep it in the closet.
oh, well, this is, put it, what are you talking about? Put it where the food is. If you want your teenagers to see it, you put it where the food is. I think every parent knows that. But yeah, rule of law is not enough, right? It's on this list, but you also have to
necessary.
have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, press, assembly, private powers, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, rule of law, due process, majority rule, minority rights, consent to the governed, democracy, republic, natural inalienable rights, liberty, equality, and justice. Like, it's all those things, right?
Excellent. Okay, Professor, you now authoritatively just totally rebutted his argument. Great. Derek.
No, 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 no. See, that's again, that's not a disagreement between the two of us. I didn't disagree with anything Derek said. I was just clarifying the way in which I agree with him.
Yeah.
Lovely.
I mean, look,
Derek.
and I know that it's easy to pin. I mean, yeah, I was responding to what he was saying. I think that those values. I mean, part of the and without getting too super, current political, is that I think that a lot of people have lost those values. And look,
Hmm.
I have profound disagreements with, for example, Ronald Reagan. Um, I mean, I would argue the most overrated political figure in the 20th century, but and that's because I oppose apartheid, in no small part, and I also am not a fan of raping nuns. Um, but I would I argue that Reagan he cared about America, he loved America, he had certain kinds of values that meant a lot to him. Nixon, the same thing. Politicians that I profoundly disagree with. Certainly George W. Bush would fall in that category. Clinton, obviously a problematic figure, but they all had certain things. We haven't run into, I mean, look, J.D. Vance has called professors, in particular professors who teach in disciplines that Steve and I teach in, the enemy of the people. And how am I supposed to deal with that? And that's where the violence comes in. Like this is where you worry about the state having the guns. This is where you worry about that Trump doesn't share the kinds of values that make me think that institutions can hold up, because he's going to intentionally undermine institutions. And so that makes it a little more difficult. I mean, before Steve came in, um, I'm fine with disagreement. I'm fine with until you say that my existence is a question of disagreement. Once you say my brother can't exist, yeah, there might be violence. We'll see where it comes from. Once you start saying that, once you start referring to shithole countries and then establishing that the rights of those shithole countries suddenly become limited, and the rights of the people in those countries, that's where it becomes problematic. That's where, oh, we can just get along, we can just disagree. Nah, if you disagree with the right of people I care about to exist, then I have a real problem with that.
So, Professor, tie it right back to friendship. Keep going with your thought, but how do we as citizens, I get it as a college professor, but how do we as citizens be good citizens under the guise of friendship and disagreeing under public policy and philosophy and our own backgrounds? Give us some thoughts and reactions to Professor Tootle. He had his bubble inside and outside. Do you agree with that?
Um, no, well, I mean, look, we're talking metaphor, right? So do I disagree with his metaphor? I mean, I guess I do, just like I disagree with saying there's no left and right once you understand left and right are just a metaphor for the way we try to understand the world. And if we get rid of those terms, we're going to come up with something else that's going to be equally metaphorical, right? I would say that I don't miss an era of good old boy politics where everything got done behind closed doors, but boy, there's something to be said about the idea that people who fundamentally disagree and are yelling at each other and campaigning against each other could go back in that room with cigars and bourbon and talk about things. There's something to be said for the fact that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could figure out a way to get shit done. There's something to be said for the fact that Steve and I will know when we're beginning to enter that territory where it's best off, talking about football. There's something to be said for not being a sort of soulless political automaton where you have other things, so that you have other things that you can talk about. And I think that when people are programmed to be politicians, and you see this certainly on left and right, that the conservatives have no, but like when you see people who it feels like they were created to be a political bot. I think they don't have those other things that they can value. So I mean, Steve being wrong on a whole lot of important issues doesn't change the fact that he's a good person who means well. Uh, and so I value that. I mean, it's not. We've talked about this before, right? I mean, seriously, of my five best friends in academia, four are Steve Tootle type conservatives. You know, George H.W. Bush kind of Main Street Republicans who would have opposed certain things on based on kind of values, fiscal responsibility, less socially conservative than fiscally conservative, but also having certain kinds of sense of the way things should change and shouldn't. I mean, seriously, my closest friends in a lot of my closest friends in academia feel like they don't have a political party anymore, because those values are still there, but they don't feel like there's a party that holds them up. And I think that, the fact that Steve and I have been able to function reasonably successfully and not only as friends, but also in environments where, I mean, I'm a blue dot in a very, 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 very red part of the country. And while Steve's in a pretty red part of California, he is awash in a sea of blue surrounding him, including the institutions for which he works. And you can most of the time make it go. And so I think that Brutus was a bad friend, right? Because he allowed those political things to get in the way so that he was willing to abandon a friendship, for other things. And I'd like to think that loyalty would trump that, but it's partially because I'm not friends with the kind of people who think that the way that I think too many people think. Hating the wrong people becomes a political ethos.
Fascinating. We're going to switch gears if you don't mind. You'll get to jump back in and again a little bit, but we need to hear from Professor Knott. And so, Professor Knott, if you'll do the kindness of telling us your,
Sure.
areas of expertise and degrees, and also talk about your latest book. I think you've written more than one, but your latest book, and then your retort or expansions on anything Professor Tootle or Professor Katzman said. Professor Knott, you're up.
Sure. I received my PhD in political science, but I've been a closet historian all my life. I always wondered whether I'd gone down the wrong path, and I still wonder at the advanced age of 67 whether I should have focused on history as opposed to poli-sci. But anyways, that's my field. I've written 10 books. My most recent one is on President Kennedy, and I'm currently at work on a book on conspiracy theories.
Ooh.
I want to follow up on what Derek was saying because I share, if I understood him correctly, I think we are in somewhat uncharted territory, at least in my life, in that the public square has really been poisoned. And I understand this is a discussion we're supposed to be having about friendship, but I do think we have an incoming president who's poisoned the public square with his rhetoric. Derek cited some of it, referring to people, certain folks, as enemy of the people, talking about immigrants having bad genes, poisoning the American gene pool, targeting a former member of his own party, Liz Cheney, basically suggesting, at least as I interpreted it, that she should be executed. Just a constant barrage, challenging the integrity, challenging the Americanism of his opponents. And for me, it all culminated on January 6, 2021. I have a very, very close friend, arguably my closest lifetime friend. His son attended the January 6th insurrection. And that's been a real problem for me because at that point, that's not politics. That's that was a violent attempt to overthrow this government. It was, in essence, a coup, and I can't forgive that. That's not politics to me. This is a question of simple morality. And, we all have to draw certain lines, it seems to me. I mean, I can call him up and we can talk about football, but I have no desire to do that. None. Because, it wasn't him, it was his son, but he defends his son, and I can't take it. So I've had one of my best friendships, I won't say destroyed, but it's on life support due to Trump and Trumpism. And again, we are in very uncharted territory. I've got a couple of young grandkids. I pray that they're going to inherit the same republic I grew up with, but I'm no longer confident about that. And again, I'm not willing to maintain friendships with people who are just happy about throwing all that away. I'm not prepared to throw it away. So if I have to draw some lines with friends, I'm going to do that. By the way, Steve Tootle is a saint. He's one of the best teachers out there. He cares about his students. He really is, Steve. I know you're embarrassed, but this guy puts his heart and soul into his students. And I don't know a lot of professors who do that. So this is an outstanding human being. I just wanted to work that in.
Well, let me work in on that and then ask a question. So, Professor Tootle, you didn't even see my post yesterday where I said, hey, say something nice about a mutual friend. Did you see that?
I saw it this morning.
Oh,
Yeah,
well, one of the last ones, I was so thrilled that Rachel, I forget her last name, Rachel.
Manfredi. Yeah.
Yeah, Manfredi, who we met. The reason we even know each other is the American Enterprise Institute. We were both Leadership Network things a decade ago, and she was the organizer of it with Arthur Brooks. She said, you are one of the most kindest, thoughtful, decent humans she's ever met. How would you not love somebody like that who tells the world? It was a public post with a lot of good friends who brags on you like that. How do you not love
Well, I
her?
do love Rachel. First of all, I would say the same thing about her. I mean,
Isn't that
and,
ego?
and that's another, let's to turn it back on the subject of friendship. I think one of the other things is like I derive so much happiness from knowing that my friends are out there. I don't call Rachel every week or every month. We might go a year without speaking, but I was on a long drive. I drove for 8 hours yesterday. I had to pick my sister up in San Francisco and drive her home. So I was in the car for 8 hours yesterday. And I didn't have any, but the funny thing is I thought about Rachel and Derek and Steve Knott and, and you and Tony. And you're going down the freeway, I just derive so much happiness knowing that these people are out in the world, and how much I get out of my relationships with such good people. I just feel so like honored that they're in my life, but also that, I mean, I don't know if pride is the right word, but it just makes me feel good about myself that these people who really, and George Nash is another guy I'll throw into this category. I don't know if you know who George Nash is, but the fact that George Nash is my friend, I should put that on my tombstone. Like, he's such a good human being that set aside anything about him academically or who he is in the world, but like, I think he's one of the nicest, kindest, most generous, thoughtful people I've ever been around. And
Has he written a book?
he's written a bunch.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Let me keep going if you don't mind, Professor. Going back to Professor Knott, you just heard that wonderful story of friendship and the visceral reaction that you described with one of your very best friends and son. And by the way, I agree with you on January 6th. So we're peas in a pod on that. But 49.9% of America, including my direct family members, direct neighbors, I mean, gosh, a lot of people we know voted
Yeah.
differently than it looks like you and I voted. How do we take history or political science? How do we use the skills that you three have developed over your whole lifetimes into being better citizens? What gives them in this advice? You failed wisely, perhaps, but not everybody has to be that yes or no. How do we
Yeah.
work our way through this system? Give some wisdom for us.
John, I wish I had some wisdom for you. I seriously am struggling with this right now. And I'm finding it hard to maintain these aren't particular. I mentioned an extreme example of my close friend.
Sure.
There are other folks in a very broad circle that I've met over a long academic career, and I'm struggling whether to maintain contact with them because, in part, many of them are former students or colleagues who said or told me for years that they do believe in the Constitution. They do have some notion of the importance of the rule of law in a republic. I thought they shared those beliefs. I'm now finding out perhaps that was just cover for some ideological preferences or some partisan preferences. So I'm struggling, John. I
Okay,
don't
so
have a good answer for you. I really don't.
Well,
you're
let me ask
here,
it in a different
Professor
way
Tootle.
because John, so Steve, since you're on the show and you, 3 books ago, I think, was your book on Washington and Hamilton. Just what was their friendship like? Would you call it a friendship, first of all, because of the
That's a
age
good.
difference, or and what I'm hoping is that like history is magical. And I always tell my students, I don't have to teach you how this is going to change you. We're just going to study the past and something's going to happen. I'm not. So let's just talk about the relationship between
Yeah.
Washington and Hamilton. And I bet something magical will just happen. And we're going to learn, there's going to be something we draw from it.
Steve, it did not, as you know, it did not start off as a friendship at all. Washington was clearly a superior in a military relationship. Hamilton was a subordinate. Hamilton, for 4 years or so, was a staff officer for George Washington. Washington, according to Hamilton, could be prickly to deal with. He was not always, he's a revered figure in American life, but he was a human being under extraordinary pressures. And those staff officers had to bear the brunt of his he had quite a temper. So there's not a friendship at the beginning. I think over the decades between the revolution until Washington's death in 1799, that relationship evolves. And I would say in the last couple of years of Washington's life, it does become a friendship. It's no longer superior and subordinate. And the piece of evidence that's the strongest proclaiming it was a friendship, a genuine, affectionate friendship, was when Hamilton gets into trouble for having an extramarital affair. The Jeffersonians published that fact, hoping to destroy Hamilton. And Washington rallies to Hamilton's defense. He did not need to do that. In fact, Washington, in a way, put his own reputation on the line for Alexander Hamilton. That's the point, and that's in the last 2 to 3 years of Washington's life, where I would say you have a genuine, affectionate friendship. So there's an evolution there that takes place between, let me just quickly add this, two men who came from entirely different backgrounds. One is an immigrant born on an obscure speck of an island, as John Adams liked to say, who comes to the United States penniless. The other is a member of the Virginia gentry, a slave owner. I mean, the differences were extraordinary, but by the end of their lives, they formed a friendship that I would argue was the most important in American history. Now, what's the lesson there? I'm not sure, other than the fact that things do evolve, relationships evolve.
let me ask it this way. What do you think they valued about each other? What did Hamilton value about Washington, and what did Washington value about
Well, I
Hamilton?
know Washington valued Hamilton's intellect, understood that Hamilton was smarter than he was. And by the way, Washington was a leader who wasn't threatened by others around him who were smarter than he was. And I wish we would see more of that. So Washington was comfortable in his own skin, knew that Hamilton knew economics. Hamilton was an incredibly hard worker, could work around the clock, producing reports on a moment's notice. So Washington at first admired Hamilton's intellect and his work ethic. Again, over time, I think it evolves into a genuine friendship. Hamilton admires the fact initially that George Washington is a shield for him. He's a guy, I mean, if Hamilton had not met Washington, we wouldn't know the man's name. I'm convinced of it. And Hamilton understood this as well. Now, I don't want to make it sound like Hamilton was using Washington, but he certainly understood that Washington made him the important historic figure he was. So I don't know if that answers your question, Steve, but it gives, I think, a little bit of insight.
Yeah, I think so. And in terms of, I always say, well, like I said, history's magical. We never know how it's going to affect us. But understanding that when two people come together, we don't know if we're going to be friends or not.
Yeah.
You never know who you're going to hit it off with and why. And my relationship with my advisor and Derek's advisor, Alonzo Hamby, we knew him theoretically before we knew him in reality. I admired him as a historian. That's why I went to Ohio University, was to study under him. And then, of course, you get to know him, and there are some things about him. I mean, he was incredibly boring, and he had a sinus infection. He'd make us turn off the air conditioning in humid southeastern Ohio, and you just watch the steam run down the windows, and he would drone on for 3 hours, and all of his jokes were in his lectures, which were pre-written, and he would laugh at the same. I mean, so he wasn't a perfect man, but but you grow to admire new things about him, and then of course, so you never know how you're going to come together.
Yeah.
You never know what that chemistry is going to be, and at first maybe it is a little bit of I just find something about you interesting.
Yeah.
And then you grow to admire something in character that says, okay, not only do I find you an interesting thinker, somebody who's like making the brain, the electricity knock back and forth in my brain. So you're an interesting thinker, and you seem to be a person of character, well, now we're going to let this evolve, into a relationship that involves trust.
So let me interrupt, professors.
Yeah.
For all three professors, I have this rudimentary understanding. Hopefully, it's a little better than rudimentary, but understanding that this isn't true around the world and throughout history, where you can get to learn something about somebody and maybe make their friendship, going back to Washington and Hamilton, or going back to you, Professor Tootle and Hamby. It is a almost uniquely American thing, American exceptionalism properly defined, as you always say. All three professors, do you agree with that? That we still are in a pretty special place in America. Supposedly half of America hates the other half. I get it. But still, if you want to think something new, you can still do it. If you want to create a new business, you can still do it. You want to create new friendships, you can do it. That's not true everywhere in the world. You have to be born to somebody in many places around the world still today. Will you just talk about that, all three of you, for a minute? Then we're going to open up to questions. And General Halter, you're going to be up first. So get ready.
I'm going to jump in. I mean, I disagree with that. I've lived in enough of the rest of the world to have the same kinds of friendships emerge out of nowhere, and deep, kinds of thoughts. Like no one has ever successfully explained to me how we're actually truly freer than people in London or people in Johannesburg in a lot of ways. I mean, there's economic stifling, but I can bring you places where there's that as well. I can go in almost any direction from where I am in San Antonio right now. So I mean, I don't think there's anything uniquely American about that. And there's a long history before America where there were friends prior to the existence of, I'm not going to get into this debate, but whatever year you want to artificially trace as the origins of the United States. I tend to, I disagree with that. Now, obviously, Steve's example earlier of the person coming from the Soviet Union, friendships, generally speaking, here don't have to, don't have any hint of danger, except maybe when you get Steve and me in a restaurant. But I mean, there's no, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I worry about any kind of particular exceptionalist narratives, and I get to see them, by the way, also in South Africa. There are exceptionalist narratives in South Africa as well that I don't think do any good, and I think can actively do harm. So I don't necessarily buy that. I don't think there's anything uniquely American about any of this. I think that, in fact, friendship transcends all that sort of stuff. My dear friends in South Africa, my dear friends in the UK, are I value similar things, right? That Steve was talking about: intellect, for me, wit, humor, um, a certain kind of quickness of thought, and I gotta say, might have to scratch beneath the surface, because I think you got to scratch beneath the surface with me. But a certain softness, that maybe not many people see, but the fact that you're willing to let people into that, is important as well. And I think that transcends whatever flag waves over your house on your national holidays.
Lovely. Professor Tootle or not?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything particularly intelligent to add to that. I mean, one thing that came to mind, arguably Washington's closest friend, he didn't have a big circle of friends, was Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat, um, who, adored Washington and was cherished in return. So there's an example of an international friendship, perhaps beyond the bounds of, something uniquely American. The other thing I thought of, and this, I don't know, I'd have to think more about it, but during the Holocaust, while most folks went along or stayed quiet, I guess I should say, some certainly assisted, millions probably assisted. Um, there were examples of folks who put their own neck on the line to save maybe one individual. They might have taken a Jewish child in, pretended they were their child and that they were Catholic or whatever. There's, Yad Vashem in Israel has, countless tributes to Europeans who, went well beyond something we might call friendship, actually displayed something we call heroism, putting their necks literally on the line to save people they didn't even know. Thousands of examples of that. I wish there were more examples of that, but there were quite a few.
Yeah, actually, to build on that point, we had a speaker 2 weeks ago who was 92 years old, and she was telling her story of how she had escaped from the Nazis, and eventually where her family ended up was in this small French town that was in Vichy. And the official population of the town was about half of what the population was. And that means that half the people who were there, she said, were hiding, and most of them were Jewish. And she said, what's remarkable is if anybody in this town had reported, half the people living in this town are Jewish, Now, of course, eventually the Nazis did invade and they had to run again. But, it is remarkable that you had this town in the middle of Vichy, France, where they were hiding 1,500 to 2,000 Jews or other people escaping Nazis. And of course, as a symbol of the modern era, her talk was, interrupted by people accusing her of genocide, and we had to clear the room and call the police, and it ended in a riot. But a 92-year-old, survivor of, anyway, subject for another day. But I think there's something to be said for friendship in this international question as well, because I've always said that, American exceptionalism properly understood, because you never know what other people mean by those words. I think it is important that the United States became an example that human beings could live with one another peacefully. Not that we're angels, but that we could live with one another peacefully. But the second part of that involves a relationship with the rest of the world as we began to demonstrate that countries could live peacefully with one another. And Britain was obviously one of the most important examples of this, but also our just sort of stumbling, bumbling relationship that we had with every other nation on earth, where through trial and error, we discovered, and hopefully the world discovered, and hopefully we don't go back from this, but that it's actually in our best interest as a nation, it's in our national security interest that other countries should be safe and prosperous and free. And that every single other country on earth that is safe and prosperous and free is no security threat to the United States. And we incentivize that a peaceful relationship with other countries. So there's, yes, a part of it that involves the United States and the relationship between the United States and Britain. But I do think that the spread, and I would say that Professor Katzum, Derek's not wrong to point out that there are a lot of great places on earth now. And that before the Heritage Foundation was sort of captured and doing whatever it's doing now, they used to publish this Index of Economic Freedom. And I think they finally took it down. I don't know if it's still there, but I just watched as the United States kept going lower and lower and lower on the index until we were in the mostly free category. And I'd saying to my classes, I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and we're the 27th freest country on earth. But that doesn't mean that we didn't play a special role in creating this system that makes that incentivized peace and proved that not only could human beings live with one another peacefully, again, not that we're all angels, but that we can live with one another and govern ourselves. But also nations could do that too. And I hope that we don't lose that, because it's a pretty precious thing.
Agreed. All right, I got to transition again, Professor.
Gotcha.
Friends, I've invited Professor Tootle. I've invited a couple friends today that to kind of demonstrate friendship, and actually most of these people I actually admire more than I'm friends with. I just think they're amazing individuals. Starting with General Halter, if he was still in Colorado, but he cared about his family and had to move back east or something, but he was a cabinet member for a governor. He would governor. I would vote for you for governor in 2 years, General Halter. If you were still in Colorado, you would be an excellent governor 2 years, and I'm giving you a little time to come back. So, what is your question on any subject you like for any of the three professors or all of them?
Well, one, this has been great, and thank you for inviting me. I'm trying to take all this in. I'll just say something. I was getting ready to post it on Facebook a few days ago, and then I decided not to. I've really stopped posting political stuff for the most part on Facebook, really just before the election. And since I just feel like it's hard to take in everything that's happened. But the thing I was going to say at the time is I believe America is exceptional because of its ideas. The things that it brought there, the things that Professor Tootle was just saying is, you have to, I guess you could say, if not for the United States, would all the things we see in terms of participatory democracy / republics in the world, would it have existed? The answer is probably at some point, but much slower maybe than it did because of what happened here 250 years ago. But the other part of that is, but I no longer believe that Americans are exceptional. When I had, in my military career, I spent almost 9 years in Europe, 5 years in Japan. I also spent time in nasty places in the Middle East. But the thing I noted over time, living, not just visiting Europe or something, but living there among people. And then as I got more senior, having relationships with local governmental officials and stuff, for instance, in England especially, I started to understand that Americans weren't living up to the ideals we professed. And, a lot of people that are in the military over there frequently come across, and I probably did when I was first there, like, well, we've got this thing hacked and you guys are catching up and we're encouraging you, but, we're the stars of the show. And over time, I came to realize that probably wasn't true. And it was mainly because of us. The Constitution, especially, and all the things that led up to it. And then our history early on, which is checkered for sure, and meanly so as regards lots of the way we treated Native Americans and certainly human enslavement, etc. But there was a trajectory that was moving forward. And then we got to this point where I think Americans have shown themselves to actually be more interested in economics and their day-to-day whatever. And by the way, that affects all of us, affects me too, but have put on the back burner the Constitution and rule of law things. And that's what happened in the election. And I'm not saying they all think that's, they want to get rid of all that. I don't think they realize what they've done, frankly. So this idea that Americans are exceptional, yes, but it's because of our ideas, because those ideas started something that got to be big, both in our nation and other places. But I think we've lost that panache of exceptionalism, I think, in the eyes of many overseas. And the other thing I'll note is, I think it was said earlier, our relationships matter. And this is the hardest conversation I have with people from the other side, people in my own family and stuff. When they say, why do we spend all that money? I said, you don't understand. I've lived there. I was in Afghanistan on the ground in the early days. I was in the Desert Storm, and I saw the destruction on the ground level. I was an Air Force guy, but I was a liaison with the Army at the time. So I saw what happened and how things worked out. Being in Afghanistan in the early days in 2002, going out among the people when we still could do that freely. I was just a brand new one-star, but with limited security, we could be around and see people. The hollowness in people's eyes after 20 years of war, and the emptiness in their souls, and people you'd meet that were your age that looked like they were 20 years older. And people don't get that we are only a couple of phases away from stuff like that at any given time. And I'm not saying we've gotten this much closer just because of this election, but I think people have forgotten that if you don't have the Constitution and that rule of law and the way that we can cuss and discuss about stuff, all these other issues that are very important and that we're all not going to agree on, but if you don't preserve that piece, if you allow somebody to run roughshod over it, it will dissipate very quickly and you will not recover it. And there are places in the world where that's true, in history and currently. So that's where I get into this, so really don't have a question per se. This has been very informative for just listening to some people who've thought about this more fully than I've been able to. But I would just go back to this idea, are Americans really exceptional people anymore? Have we proven ourselves to just be ordinary people that just really hit on a really good thing, and now we're using it to basically for our personal self-aggrandizement?
Professor Tootle, you're the star of the show. Do you have a quick reflection on the general's comments?
No, I just say that every generation is invaded by barbarians, children, and what we've done pretty systematically since the 80s and 90s is stop teaching them history. And what we are reaping now is the result of 40 years of almost ignorance that was done on purpose. I was talking about this with my sister on the drive back from San Francisco, but we're now to the point where and I noticed Tom Brasino just logged on, so we have somebody. So we got Professor Brasino from the Army War College. We have Steve Knott from the formerly of the Naval War College. So the war colleges are well represented on the podcast today. We were just talking about how the problem is that teachers don't even understand the context and even good curriculum. The problem with many teachers is they don't know what to do with it because they sort of have learned history as a series of unconnected, unrelated paragraphs that they're supposed to communicate, but they don't know what any of them mean. Something that I don't know if Derek or Tom was the first one to say this, or maybe I think this was an old Tom. Was it Charlie Alexander who said this, that content is pedagogy? Was that an Alexander line? Charles Alexander, a great baseball historian. I think that was his, but maybe we should bring in Tom Brasino and have him introduce himself too, since he just logged in.
Yeah, Professor Brasino, thanks for joining us. You're an hour late, so I'm going to be fascinated to see how you can incorporate in a really deep conversation. But please introduce yourself and talk briefly about friendship in whatever way you'd like to.
Oh,
There we go. Can you hear me?
Well, we
Yep.
can hear you.
Can't
Yes,
see-
we got
hey,
you. We can see you. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
you went on mute again, Professor. Hold on. Take yourself off mute. Maybe I can do it for you. Now you're still on mute.
I'm gonna try it.
There
How
you
about
go.
now?
There we go. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, good. Yeah, sorry I'm late. I was at a wrestling practice, and I'm taking a kid to another one. So I just saw the note. Thank you for the reminder, John, about doing this stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. I just kind of caught the end of that stuff.
Well, how about this?
Yeah.
Why are you still friends with Derek Katzen? Let's I'll ask you that question cold, and then we'll see if your answer is the same as mine.
I think your answer was probably stolen from mine, right? It was
Yeah.
so which was like the line of the stuff. I mean, it is interesting, right? Because we do have some pretty significant belief differences and ideas of the world differences and stuff like that. But how much more loyalty, honor, honesty matters, right? So like we might, we certainly disagree on things, but it's an honest disagreement, and we both like trust that our disagreements are honest. We agree on plenty of stuff too. Part of the reason I think Steve gave his line about this stuff, like, yeah, I got somebody who would, if I'm in trouble, I know who I'm calling. That list is pretty short. And I get some help from it, and somebody who would, like, the line was always say he crawl through broken glass. For it, there was a line I always gave for it. Like, and that's true, right? Like, and it's pretty rare, and it's really important. But that that kind of trust and knowing somebody has your back makes a big difference in friendship, and it's really what it's all about. And in a very honest sense, like, we all have our jealousies about each other. It's like sort of funny, like, by and large, Derek and Steve and I maybe get to like share our jealousies of others, like in our gripes together. But like that tends to be with strangers. It's like, you think about the academic job market, and it's like, I don't know who that person is, why they get a job. It's all fixed. They suck. We're good. But we would never say that about each other, right? Like, and I think it's big, so if, whenever, Derek has had success or Steve's had success, three of us, like, I've always like taken great delight in that, and I know they're the same for me, right? So anytime we have success, it's that kind of, the good, it's the type of love that's more than just, brotherly love. It's the sort of agape love, the, willing the good of the other. And, that's a key, I think that's a key aspect of it. Like, we all have that in it. We all know that about each other. We never, like, he didn't deserve that,
Yeah, I've never been jealous of Tom or Derek because I know how hard they work.
Yeah,
like they've deserved everything they've ever gotten. And I've never, anytime they've had any kind of success, it's always, we celebrate that, and with never an ounce of jealousy,
So let me interrupt again, Professor.
But they're
Sorry.
also funny. I want to say the moment I knew I was going to be friends with Steve Knott, because I knew of him first, but it was unseasonably hot when he came here to Visalia, and I sort of apologized, and he just said, Steve Knott always brings the heat. And like, I was like, we're going to be friends. This guy, like, because
I used to be quick
humor is the
before I
big
got
deal.
old. Yeah.
It never gets old for me because it was such a perfect line, so perfectly delivered.
Professor Brasino, everyone else has given their bona fides and a little bit of like your degrees and specialties. Please do that really briefly, and now we're in Q&A time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Tom Brasino. I'm originally from Cleveland, so I have the misfortune of being a Browns fan. This is my ongoing cross to bear that I do all in my life, do that stuff. I grew up, I went to high school and college in Colorado. I went to a school called Adams State on the out there. So it's a teacher school, and I switched over. I started off as a social studies, secondary education major,
right?
Football player.
Invited back to give speech, right? That was the headline at the.
Yeah, they had a gap. They needed someone to fill a hole. So I get that. And then I went to decided to switch over. Another guy who went to, so you historians might know, Gary Gallagher, the Civil War historian, went to Adams State, and he had the same mentor as I did like 25 years earlier. And when Gary Gallagher got the Civil War chair at the University of Virginia, that was when and my professor John McDaniel passed away a year and a half ago. Oh, it was sort of celebrated that. That's when I decided to switch over and go to graduate school. Went to Ohio University, met Stephen and Derek there, and then when I got out, I ended up getting a job at the Army Center of Military History. I saw the green books, the official histories. Worked there for a little bit, and then went to Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth, and then I was there for 18 months, and then taught at the School of Advanced Military Studies for a decade. It's a great school, military school, sort of like a second-year honors academy for the Commander General Staff College. And then for the last 7.5 years or so, I've been at the U.S. Army War College, and I teach military strategy, planning, operations, things like that. So that's my stuff.
We're in Q&A section, and we're going to see. I brought some friends in. Hopefully, they're going to ask one of the four professors a question. We have 2 conservative professors and 2 liberal professors, so we're equal.
Well, hold on. I think Steve not.
I don't need to call you conservative and liberal, but
yeah, I don't know.
Right?
Uh,
In colloquial terms, in today's customary terms, wouldn't that be semi-accurate?
That's
I don't
fine.
know. I think Steve not. Do you? Are you
Well,
still? Yeah, I don't know.
I grew up in a New Frontier, New Deal worshiping family. My mother thought John F. Kennedy was a saint, and I did too as a young child. I moved rightward. Some folks would say due to the bad influence of some friends of mine. But I've written a book defending some aspects of the Reagan presidency, and I've written a book defending some aspects of George W. Bush's presidency. But on the other hand, I've also written a book defending some aspects of John F. Kennedy's presidency. So I'd like to think I'm somebody who approaches the study of the presidency with some objectivity, some non-partisanship, or bipartisanship, whatever you want to call it. So I don't know where I am at this point, John, except as I've made it clear, I find Trumpism to be utterly abhorrent.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's go to more Q&A. You want me to call you out, or should you just raise your hand or take yourself off mic? I'd love to hear from Dick Franklin. I'd love to hear from Joe Rice. Ellen, you're our only female if you're still on. I'd love to hear from you.
Hey, John, I'll go. Hi, it's Joe, everybody. Fascinating conversation, John. You're always bring great things together and provoke good thought and hopefully and often good action. And I want a reaction to something, but first I also wanted, my question will be, so what do we do now? What do we as a society do now? What's the path forward? What you've made me think about my philosophy of relationships is that relationships should generally overall make all parties better, right? That applies to work relationships, personal relationships, all kinds of relationships, right? They should make all parties better overall, right? There's always give and take, there's always ebb and flow, but they should overall make both parties better. And I guess, my question is, what's the reaction or your thoughts on that in the context you're talking about, like the American political system and our relationship in the governed and maybe it's John Locke, kind of the consent of the governed. But also, what's the answer? What do we need to do here?
Any professor.
Yes, I agree with the first one, and that generally relationships need to get. But what I was thinking of is actually another, because we got 2 OU guys here. I was thinking back to this. We had this seminar once, and it was on terrorism, and a bunch of peace activists and a couple of historians. And the peace activists were asked, sort of like, what do we do with, Slobodan Milosevic? And they recommended sending surplus school buses over to Slobodan Milosevic. And one of the historians were like, he would turn them into gas chambers. What do you you think that we're going to have cultural exchanges when they're currently practicing genocide? In order to have a regular friendship, first you have to have, one person not trying to kill the other. And I think I did make one of our, I made one of our senior colleagues laugh, or professor laugh when I said, "Excuse me, Slobo, would you like another s'more?" and somebody spit out their food when I said that. But which I think I might have stolen from Dennis Miller. I think that was an old Dennis Miller joke, but that I recycle. But yeah, it has to be predicated on, like you said, making each other better. But I think it also there have to be some preconditions. If somebody's punching you in the face, it's not the time to say, what are your feelings about a better floor tile? Um, there has to be some level of agreed upon peace in order for a friendship to flourish. You can't. That would be my only caveat. You can't
Well,
be friends with everybody.
Professor, let me ask you this way, the same question. We've done 100 shows over 3 or 4 years over every imaginable controversial topic: Gaza, I mean, Ukraine, abortion, etc. Why do we do this? Is there a hidden agenda? Don't we? I mean, why? What is our role? Joe's asking, Colonel Rice is asking what we can do as citizens. What are you and I doing, as an example?
Well, we have an ongoing conversation about how to make America a better place. I mean, that's what we do every Friday, and we've been doing it every Friday for years. And I think it's important for people who are living in communities to actually connect with other people who are trying to make things a little bit better, and exchange ideas. If I could just implant upon one person on one school board, raise your hand and ask, like, how do we know that our history teachers know anything? Just keep asking that at a meeting. And then what's in our curriculum again? I think COVID sort of did this for a lot of parents, where they saw what their kids were working on and they were horrified. Why? Because they never looked at it before. I mean, I'm a fairly indifferent parent, I guess, to my kids learning. I look at I'll say, what are you doing for school? Who put this together, and what is this supposed to be teaching you? So I would say have those ongoing conversations.
Keep thinking,
I'll
but
leave-
not
Steve,
once
could I-
to jump in.
If I could just quickly jump in, I first met Steve Tootle in a program that teaches high school and elementary school history and civics teachers how to use primary source materials. It's basically civics and history education, very, somewhat in depth, very intense. That's where I met Steve. That's where I'm going to spend the bulk of the remaining years that I have on this planet. I've said earlier, I was debating cutting off some folks who I know went down a direction that I think is dangerous for the Republic. But I'm not going to give that aspect up. That is one thing I think perhaps, whether you're a professor or whether you're a private citizen, support civics education. Steve said, we stopped doing this for decades. And I do think that's a big factor into where we are today. Everybody focuses on the price of eggs and doesn't give a rat's ass about the Constitution. They don't even understand the Constitution. They don't understand the significance of January 6th. And that's shocking, but it's not shocking if you realize that we've stopped teaching this stuff for decades. And that's one thing I'm going to hope to continue to do. I would urge all of you, private citizen, teacher, whatever you are, support civics education in your community, however you can.
Excellent. Professor Bursino, do you have a comment for Colonel Rice?
Yeah, sure. So like along these same lines, so I do the same program that Steve was just talking about. Steve and I was just talking about, so teaching American history. I think I've done 9 of them this year. The one-day seminars. I teach a master's level class on the American military history, and I'll tell you, especially with the primary document thing, that we have this like weapon right now, and I can't tell you how powerful it is. And this will sound really stupid, but I'm telling you, it's great. Anybody watch Ted Lasso?
Sure.
Or see it or know about that show? Yeah. So Ted Lasso has this "be curious, not judgmental" scene where they're playing darts. If you haven't seen it, you just look at it, like everybody kind of who's ever seen this like knows this scene. I tell the teachers this all the time, and I think this is like how you engage with people on the other side is like be curious, not judgmental. or like at least be curious, then judgmental. Like one of the things that teachers really struggle with is that when they learn history, you know, whether they're learning it out of the textbook so that they can teach it because they didn't have enough content when they were in school, or or the content they got when they were in school about this is very, very heavily weighted towards, you know, schools of thought, analysis, you know, like explanation, you know, judgment, you know, trying to figure out like, you know, like, and these days especially, like we'll drag our current politics, current views into these things in the past, and and it all it does is it causes you to miss things that are right in front of you. So I tell them like, hey, so like let's approach all of this stuff and have your students do this. Approach it with curiosity, not judgment, and you'll be surprised. Like, and you'll find things that you sometimes miss. Like, so I always give like a great example of this. Everybody's heard of the Zimmerman telegram?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Zimmerman telegram. The Germans sent that. The Germans in World War I, when they declared unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, they sent a note. Zimmerman sent a note to the German, to his ambassador in Mexico City, telling him to make an offer to the Mexican government to join in on the war effort on the German side. And everybody's like, it's this like weird, unnecessarily provocative cockamamie scheme, right? Everybody knows like, and everybody just reads it with that judgment in mind. And so they miss all kinds of things that are in there, and they don't actually understand the real story there. And so one of the things they miss in there, which I tell us, like even people who've read the Zimmerman telegram, it's like, remember like Japan's in there? Like, why? Right? Like, why? Why is Japan in there? Yeah. And then you can kind of like you get aside from the like you start asking different questions. And there's like a whole story with this. There's a whole thing about this thing called the Plan of San Diego, and that the United States had put 120,000 troops on the southern border the year before. So like there was a reason why the Germans they wanted to have 120,000 American troops on the southern border, because then they wouldn't be in Europe, and then they win the war, and Germany wins the war. Like, you know, that sort of thing happens. But also that Japan had been playing around trying to get trying to get a port on the eastern side of the Pacific. Like, we forget this, which is like a threat to the Panama Canal, and then you get all these like interesting things. It's a whole different story. Like, you know, and it all comes from. But I'm telling you, most people they read the Zimmerman telegram, they're like, "Oh, this is dumb," and they don't even notice that the word Japan is in there. Like by getting the Japanese in there, it's like fascinating. And so, you know,
I'll tell us.
don't. I was gonna say like another one that we hear too, like and it comes up is like John Quincy Adams' Fourth of July speech. Yeah, you know and was it 1821? Like it's the don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Like,
Yeah.
you know, read that thing, or Washington's farewell address. You know, which will sometimes talk about entangling alliances. You don't notice that he also talks about entangling grudges, antagonisms that we get caught up in. This is a great lesson for China right now. Like, they're not our enemy. We're not at war with China. Like, but we're falling exactly into this trap that Washington talks about in there. We miss that. We also miss the fact that like 3/4 of that document is about the threat to union, you know, internally, and like just how fragile this experiment is. And so like we need to like be very careful. It's not really about foreign policy that much. It's actually a very small portion of it. But we already think we know what it's about, so we read it the wrong way. So, you know, I say this like be curious, not judgmental, and you'll be surprised how many things like, oh yeah, we agree on almost all this stuff. You know, but don't dig in on the one thing that we disagree about. You know, like and then we start from the point of disagreement because we're already on judgment instead of understanding. So that's kind of my.
Like 3 or 4 minutes left. Thank you for Professor Tootle. Did you have a response to that?
Just to, you know, I would say that, you know, Eisenhower's farewell address is the same way. Everybody takes the sort of famous line, like read the whole thing. The whole thing is brilliant, you know, but it's about statesmanship and balance. And then I'll tell a story about myself that's bad, which is that I did the same thing with the frontier thesis, where I just sort of dismissed it. And then one day I actually read it and I was curious and not judgmental. And I was like, oh, okay, this is actually making a really important point about democracy. Why was I, but I had just acquired this, you know, because smart people I admired had dismissed this document. So I thought that this is how a smart person acts, is they act cool and cynical about these things. And so that's a great lesson, to be curious and not judgmental, especially or judgmental later. I like that caveat too. That's good.
Can I jump in quickly?
Yeah.
The same thing with the I Have a Dream speech. Like, dear God, conservatives, learn something other than the content of the character line, because there's shit in that speech before that really does lay out the stuff that you're not agreeing with. And in fact, that whole part that may or may not have been impromptu was not even the nut meat of that speech. One thing that I do in my classes, the older a student is, the more I trust them to be able to make some judgments. But when politicians are talking about us sort of inculcating students, I'm like, dude, I am trying to make them understand why it wasn't called World War I right away. Like they didn't know there was going to be a sequel, right? You think my students are ready for me to be. The other thing I do in my survey class is I can get criticized for it, but I have an intentional lag. My survey class goes to 9/11. And my lecture on the 90s, which will be next Thursday, it's one lecture on the 90s, unlike many of the other decades, is a personal history of the 90s. Because I was in my 20s, just like most of them are in their 20s, and I walk them through it and let them know. But I tell them point blank, I have no interest in getting into Trump with you. I have no interest in getting into Obama with you. I have no interest in, eventually I'm gonna have to get into George W. Bush. I usually have a lag of about 20 years, so I'm hitting that point now. But part of it is that, yeah, look, I don't like Ronald Reagan, but I can think about him historically in a class in front of students. And if I'm writing in a book, I have license to be more critical. And then depending on, so in my last book on American sports, I go after DeSantis and I go after a lot of American conservatives in the intro, but then the history is sort of proper and real. And I think that when I teach a student, when I'm teaching undergrads, part of it is to keep, the further away I get, the more I'm capable of removing my politics and maybe of allowing a sort of gracious cynicism to creep in, because I can see the strengths and weaknesses of Clinton, and God knows there were plenty of both. I can see the strengths. I've come to really admire George H.W. Bush more than I did. I mean, I'm glad he wasn't reelected, but he probably deserved to be in a lot of ways. I'm deeply skeptical of Reagan, but I get why he was an important historian. Um, you're allowed to like Pearl Jam more than Nirvana, but you got to understand why Nirvana was important. And I think that a lot of that with history and like Stephen Knott, I wrote a book on the Freedom Rides where Kennedy obviously plays a pretty central role, and he also does not come across very well.
Yeah.
And yet there's a lot to admire about Kennedy. And what I love talking about with Kennedy is that Kennedy wanted to lower taxes across the board, and Republicans thought that would be fiscally irresponsible. So there's nothing even inboard about many of the things that we sort of believe in that are fixed ideologies. And one thing I think is deeply problematic is that history was a little more complicated when the most conservative Americans in the country were Southern Democrats, and the most liberal Americans in the country were Northern Democrats, except for their Northern Republican colleagues. And so where the parties and the ideologies didn't line up, and so there was more to it than that. There's a lot of convincing, there's a lot of horse trading, there's a lot of, and I think that's really important to know, because you have sort of Strom Thurmond and later version LBJ in the same party. You have Strom Thurmond and Bobby Kennedy in the same party for a hunk of that time anyways, until Thurmond changes. But you have a lot going on that it doesn't have to be just simply your ideology coming across. And frankly, I wish more politicians understood that. And that's part of what we're dealing with right now, is that the question that Joe asked was one that, if I knew how to convince the other side that I'm not the enemy of the people, then we'd solve a lot of these problems. But that rhetoric works, and then that rhetoric has come down, and it's going to be real interesting being a history professor in the Red Sea that I'm in, where now I think a lot of people are going to feel emboldened. That's one of my biggest concerns.
I just, speaking of the U.S. History Survey, this is another reason why this group is unique, and these are the three people whose books I have assigned over the last 20 years. So I used Derek's book on the Freedom Rides. I used Tom's book, A Nation Forged in War, and Steve Knott, I've used two of his books. I used to use the Hamilton and Washington, and I currently use The Lost Soul of the American Presidents. See, and then the other sort of interesting thing is that both Derek and Steve have written books sort of about grappling with themselves in the past. So Steve's last book is about his journey with Kennedy, and it ends up being an incredible book about Kennedy through this device of you're telling your own story, but really, I would say, like, everybody who studies the Kennedy presidency should also read this book, because there's a lot of stuff in there because of the unique places where you were. Anyway, so
Thank you,
I
Steve.
would say, yeah, these guys are doing it.
I've
Let me
written you
jump-
a book. Why don't you use those, fucker?
I can only assign so many books to these poor 19-year-olds, you know.
Oh my God, we should have just finished with that. Um,
Sorry, Steve Knott had something to add.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Good. Okay. Gene, I feel really bad that we've run out of time and you haven't even made a comment or a question. Same with you, Bart. Do you want to? We're over time, but you want to get one bite at the apple quickly, either Gene or Bart.
Well, well, I might add one thing to this. Well, first off, I was very, very surprised that the average number of friends nowadays is 1.9, which is a very low number. And it also implies that a lot of people have no friends. Lately, I've been studying blue zones, and that's the National Geographic study of where people live to be over 100 years old and still healthy. And what they didn't do was prioritize the factors that contribute to longevity, healthy longevity. Another person did a TED talk, and I can't remember her name, I'm afraid, right now, and she rank ordered the features of people who lived long and presumably happy lives. And the number one most important thing was socialization. The second most important one was relationships. And out of that, I think you can interpret that it's friendships. So if you want to have a good, long-lasting, relatively happy life, it really is a lot about friends.
I think that's a good ad. Good ad, Gene, and thank you for being a part of it. Gentlemen, professors, Gene's worth knowing, although he can't talk about most of his career, I think, because it's classified. But he's really worth knowing. So if you're looking for somebody really smart, he's retired now, so you can talk. It's just not about what he did. Gene, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
And Bart, hate to end with a lawyer. God, after all these, any quick thoughts, Bart?
Thanks, John. I don't think I can say it any better than what Gene just said. I think that's just great, and that's a perfect place to end because I know you're looking to do that.
Well, let's end by praising Bart. Hold on, before we let Bart go. But getting to know Bart over the last few years has really been a wonderful thing for me, and I just am very thankful and grateful for Bart. He's a wonderful person and somebody who really tries to do the right thing every single day, and I just can't praise him enough. He's definitely a good guy. So
agreed.
I'm very thankful for you. I didn't want to go before I said that to you, Bart.
Thanks, Stephen. That's very nice.
Our tribe now. Thanks for adding that, Professor Tootle. I do have one point of personal privilege. Our daughter, who's now in South Carolina, has asked for what I'd like for Christmas. And what I'd like is autographed history books. I don't know how we do it, whether you mail it to me and I Venmo it to you. So I don't know. Professors, will you please do me a favor? I want to buy a history book from each of you or make my daughter buy it. So we'll be in communications. Please, 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 it needs to be autographed. Professor Tootle, you get the last word.
Oh, I just want to say thank you. This was like a great birthday present for me to see these guys, especially on one screen. So this is the best gift anybody could have possibly gotten me. Thank you so much, John. I appreciated this.
You're welcome. And gentlemen, thank you for your time. And friends, thanks for joining in. I think it's more important of a topic than we know. I think America can't be successful if we're divided. Some famous president spoke about that at some point. I think we need to do a better job at reaching across whatever divide it is, perceived or real. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, thank you, guys. Talk to you all soon.
Bye-bye.
John.
All right, Professor, are you still gone? Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you.
Yeah, I just have a quick anecdote for you. Notice.
Hold on, let me get us off record.
Yeah.
Without our producer here, I have a harder time doing it. I don't know if I can get us off. Hold on. You better edit the last 30 seconds of this so I don't look stupid. I don't think I can stop without just stopping the recording.
All right. Well, this will be the sort of stuff that goes on after the bloopers. In my sign of love from my friends, my last, I think all of my books are all but one. In my acknowledgments, my way to shout out Steve and Tom is to do that customary thing where you're like, of course, all errors of my own are my own. And I got every mistake I made, everything problematic with Bart here as a lawyer, certainly everything litigious is Tom and Tootle's fault. And I've gone to that well in different ways on every single one of my books, and I plan to do that until I don't write any more books.
I love that. I love that. I'm telling you, folks, I've gotten to know Professor Tootle pretty well over all these shows, over all this time. And it's interesting how you two especially come up in unique ways. The reason I decided to ask you all is just because I knew this would mean a lot to him. He really deeply loves and respects you guys. And so I just think it's the neatest thing that you signed up. Professor Brusino, you should listen to the first hour when we get it published because it was kind of interesting. But it meant so much to have you sign up, especially when I bring a 2-star general and a full bird colonel. And I brought all some sorts of neat people. So I'm glad to have them here, you especially. Derek, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, we're learning there's no accounting for taste, but that's fine. All right, guys, I got to go and pretend I
Hasta
enjoy.
luego.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you guys later. Thanks, John.
See ya.
Bye.